The USSR, or the Soviet Union, was, as the name implies, a union of so-called Soviet republics, ruled by so-called Soviets, councils of working people. At least that's what the constitution said. The reality was not quite like that, to say the least, and the nations, members of the union, had next to none political weight. All roads led to Moscow. Anyway, you probably know about the 15 Soviet republics who became independent countries when the Union broke up in 1991. But there were others who simply did not survive or almost became republics. To avoid further confusion, let's distinguish three types of the Soviet republics. First, those who were part of the Union, or SSR. It's those 15 republics, plus a few short-lived ones we'll talk about in a minute. Second, those who were not part of the Union. In the period from 1917 to 1922, the time of the huge communist hype in Europe and Asia, there were dozens of mushrooming countries who declared Soviet regime. They lasted from several days to several years, but then were mostly consumed by the bigger ones who then turned into the USSR. And third, autonomous Soviet republics, or ASSR. They were basically republics in republics, not constituent members of the Union. And for a brief time in the late 1991, some of those technically became such, but no one really cared since at that point the USSR existed only on paper. Depending on who you ask, either Bulgaria or Mongolia are referred to as the unofficial 16th Republic. They had the strongest ties with the USSR within the Socialist camp, and Bulgaria indeed tried to join it, but Moscow was like, while Mongolia remained as sort of buffer state to China. But at one point, there was actually the 16th Republic, Karelo-Finnish SSR. It existed for 16 years from 1940 to 1956, and it was the northernmost, the least populated among all the Soviet republics, and the title nationalities, the Karels and the Finnish, made up a minority of its population. And yeah, it was created purely for show. In the winter of 1939, right after this happened, the USSR had a quick war with Finland, which they technically won, and to legitimize the obtained territories, a puppet state was created. It did not last long and soon asked to join the USSR. Something does not change. Subsequently, Karelo-Finnish SSR was created, formally as a peer member of the Union, as an equal 16th Republic. But in reality, it served as just a buffer state between Russia and unfriendly Finland. By the mid-50s though, the Soviet-Finnish relationships got warmer, and so the Karelo-Finnish SSR was downgraded back to just an autonomous republic within Russia, and without the Finnish in the name. Bukhara and Khorezm were two of the many of the People's Soviet republics mushrooming when the Red Army swiped across the former Russian Empire. In 1924, they declared that they are joining the Union, but they lasted so little, and the procedure of joining was somewhat unclear.
I'm sorry, is this the Soviet Union, yeah?
Yes, come in.
I saw your ad, it looks like fun, so I want to give it a try. Right now we don't receive applications, so you live unregistered for a while and then we'll be torn in pieces. I changed my mind. No, it's too late.
The rest is mine now.
So most don't even consider they were ever part of the USSR. As soon as they claimed to become part of the Union, they came under so-called national delimitation of the Soviet Central Asia. The borders were redrawn, and so Bukhara and Khorezm were split between Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Transcaucasian SFSR. This one is simple. Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan used to be one republic. And alongside Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, it was a founding member of the Union in 1922. The federation existed for almost 15 years, till in 1936 it was split between the three republics we are familiar with. Tuvan was an independent country which existed between the two world wars trapped between the USSR and Mongolia. And in 1944, it joined the USSR on conditions that are unclear. It was the last major territorial acquisition by the Soviet Union. But there was no referendum. Nobody asked whether the Tuva people wanted to join it. Their government decided for them. And the Soviets seemed to not mind. During the World War II, Tuva was an ally of the Soviet Union and was sending lots of soldiers, horses, gold and other goods to support it. And so in 1944, Stalin showed his generosity and finally allowed the country to join the Union as a brother nation who helped fight fascism. In fact, Stalin just did not need anymore another buffer state between the USSR and China. Mongolia was quite enough. So that could be an annexation disguised as a will of the nation. But Tuva did not become a Soviet republic of full value, though it could have. Its economy was so depleted by helping the big neighbor, and it was still so freaking close to China, who, by the way, were not happy about the deal. And so, recently independent nation became just an autonomous region of Russia, fully controlled from Moscow directly. And only 16 years later, the status of Tuva was raised to an ASSR. Did you know there used to be a German country in the middle of Russia? And I have a personal connection to it because my grandmother was born and lived there. So that makes me partially Deutsch. Catherine II, the famous, infamous Russian ruler, was German. And so in the late 1700s, she invited her compatriots to settle the vast plains of the empire. And by the early 20th century, there were almost 500,000 people of the German descent living mostly in the Volga region. They had a completely formed community. They spoke Deutsch. They had papers in German. They had theaters. Basically, it was a small Germany, 3,000 kilometers from the actual Germany. In 1918, it became the first autonomous region of the Soviet Russia, and in 1923, one of the first autonomous republics of the USSR. And so continued up to summer 1941. And you know what happened then. Fearing that the Volga Germans would collaborate with the Nazis, the entire community, hundreds of thousands of people, were by force relocated and diffused across the country, mostly to the neighbor Kazakhstan, and so the autonomous republic was abolished. There were attempts to recreate the German autonomy later, but that did not happen for various reasons. Nowadays, majority of the people and their descendants have moved to Germany, except mostly some of the older generation, including my grandma. If you want, I'll tell her story in one of future videos. I've been to Kazakhstan more than 10 times, I think. 3 days and nights in a train, 8 times crossing the border, mostly at night. I cannot believe I handled that, but I was a kid. Anyway, so